We were on a family trip the other day, and we got to a big city, and it started out beautiful. We pulled onto this gigantic 4-lane freeway, and we started cruising along. The traffic was moving. It was amazing because it was easy access. You get on that thing, the cars are moving really quickly, and despite the fact there were a lot of cars, you could move right along. The problem was, as soon as we got a little ways down that freeway, Chicago traffic hit. And it seemed out of nowhere we were in a traffic jam. It wasn't even rush hour, and yet all of a sudden all the cars were coming to a halt, and we were getting nowhere fast. Well, it started to remind me of a few things. It reminded me of that passage that Jesus talked about, and it's in Matthew chapter 7, and it starts in verse 13. And he talks about wide is the gate and broad is the way. He doesn't say that leads to a traffic jam, but spiritually speaking, he says it leads to destruction. And boy, that freeway started to remind me, it wasn't any expressway anymore, but people were jammed on there. And it reminded me of the ways of this world, the priorities of this world, that this world is into pleasure, it's into power, it's into prosperity, and everybody's jamming that same highway, trying to get all of those things for themselves. And yet, where does it lead? It just leads to a way of disappointment. It is an expressway that leads to the wrong values. And yet, Christ compares that and contrasts it to God's way. And he says in verse 14, he says, "Straight is the gate, and narrow the way that leads to life." Now imagine this picture that we've got up on the monitor. This is what I imagine Christ speaking of his way, because his way is the path that leads to righteousness. It's the path ultimately that leads to kingdom, to God's kingdom. And that way is a path of faith. It's a path of commitment. You can't wander too far off that path before you get into trouble. And so you've got to stay on that path. And you've got to read your Bible, pray every day, stay close to God, because that's the path that leads to life. And so whenever you get in a traffic jam, maybe remember this story. Remember that comparison that Christ made, and let's live and walk on that true path, that narrow path of righteousness that leads to God's kingdom. That's BT Daily. We'll see you next time.